A few years ago, when I was at the State Department, Secretary Colin Powell called me into his office and asked me if I would like to be the special envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. The peace process had been languishing for a number of years, which really wasn't all that surprising, since it was embedded in a centuries-long conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. I was flattered to be asked and immediately accepted. And later that day, when I shared the good news with a friend of mine, he said to me, "Mitchell, don't be so flattered. No one else wanted the job." A few months later, when I found myself in Belfast, I began to understand what he meant. That day, I was seated across a negotiating table from 3 hardened veterans of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. We were there that day to explore ways we could advance the peace process. At a particularly tense moment in our negotiations, one of the IRA leaders became agitated, then angry, and he leaped across the table to strike me. Only at the last minute did one of his colleagues grab him by the belt and yank him back into his chair. And then our discussions continued. But later that evening, I wondered, is it ever really possible to reach a peace agreement with such men who see violence as the easiest answer to resolving all differences? Is it ever really possible to reach a peace agreement with men who have so much blood on their hands? A few months later, I returned to Belfast, and I had a different experience. This time, it was America's Independence Day, July 4th, and the Consul General was hosting a garden party at the consulate. We invited the good and the great from Northern Ireland to attend. And after the hors d'oeuvres and the cocktails had been served, I noticed that some of our guests were clustering in small groups in the corners of the garden. And when I looked more closely, I saw that these people had lost loved ones and family members to the terror and to the violence. And the people they were talking to so intently were former terrorists. And I thought to myself, how is this possible? How do you have the charity, the generosity of spirit, to talk, to listen, to engage with men responsible for inflicting so much pain and sorrow and suffering on you and your family? I knew that I didn't possess that capacity, and I thank God that I didn't have to. A few years later, I left the State Department, but I carried these images and these questions with me. And I had the chance to travel around the world to different conflict zones where governments were being assaulted by terrorist movements. Sri Lanka, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Israel, North Africa, Spain, and elsewhere. And I met with government ministers, security officials, counterterrorism experts, even former terrorists, trying to find the answers to these questions, not simply to satisfy my own personal curiosity, but because there were underlying policy reasons to find out these answers. Because terrorism was spreading across the Middle East, to Africa, South Asia, and beyond. One of the first things I learned is that there are many reasons not to talk to terrorists, in fact, never to talk to terrorists. And perhaps the most famous one is that it smacks of appeasement. You are rewarding bad behavior. And the historical touchstone is the Munich Agreement. And no one ever wants to be compared to Neville Chamberlain. Another reason is that each time a government sits down across the table from a terrorist movement, it's conferring a benefit. It is raising up that terrorist movement to a position of moral equivalency. It is legitimizing and validating that terrorist group, the validation and legitimacy that many of these groups crave. And why would a government ever want to give such a gift? Because after all, governments prefer to defeat terrorists, not to negotiate with them. And if the government is democratically elected, then there are other reasons why it shouldn't negotiate. Because there are voices domestically that would argue against it. And typically, these come from the people who are putting their lives on the line, risking their lives every day in the war on terror. The security forces, the military, and the police. And of course, all those families who have lost loved ones to the terror. And a final reason not to talk is because the terrorists may not be sincere. They may not be genuine in their desire to renounce violence. They may be playing for time to regroup, rearm, and reload. And this ploy is as old as history itself. Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian Wars, talks about how the Greek city-states sent a delegation to Athens to buy time so that they could better prepare for the coming war. So there are many valid reasons not to talk. But not talking is not cost-free. You pay a price when you decide not to engage. And the price you pay is that you may have missed an opportunity to end the killing and end the violence. No less an authority than General David Petraeus observed a few years ago, we may not be able to kill or capture our way out of every insurgency. We may have to learn how to talk to some of these folks. But how does the government do that? After all, terrorists don't take out full-page ads in the New York Times revealing their intentions. Far more likely is that a government will receive a cryptic message on a Tuesday hinting that the terrorist movement may be interested in talking. But a few days later, on a Thursday, a bomb will go off, killing innocent lives. Which signal is the real one? Which signal reflects the true intentions of the terrorist movement? Well, the truth is it's hard to tell. And in fact, governments can't tell until they engage, until they test, explore, and probe with the terrorists whether they're willing to renounce violence or not. And that takes a very long time. Any government that makes that decision to engage has to understand that it will demand reservoirs of patience, because these types of engagements take far longer than any politician expects and far longer than any of us would wish. And there are reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the terrorists are unsophisticated. Generally, they're poorly educated. They don't get out a lot. They have used violence since they were very young men, teenagers, or even young boys. And so one of the challenges that the governments must overcome is that they need to educate and explain to the terrorists how you structure a negotiation and what the rules of the road are. And if the terrorist movement receives its inspiration from a divine authority, if it is religiously inspired, then these types of engagements take even longer. Because if you have received your instructions from the Almighty, well, we know the Almighty doesn't compromise. So how can a terrorist movement possibly do so? And it's important to remember that many of these terrorist groups are not monolithic. They're not monoliths. They have factions within them. And they have some factions that are more interested in exploring the possibility of talking to a government, and they have some factions that are violently opposed to any sense of compromise whatsoever. So any terrorist leader that is interested in exploring talking to the government has to be very cautious, very careful, very wary of alienating and offending his colleagues in the movement, which often can have fatal consequences. So the government has to understand this is a long process and it has to have patience. The government also has to understand that that patience at the negotiating table must be matched by a similar determination on the battlefield. The government cannot hope to win at the negotiating table what it can't defend on the battlefield. And what I mean here is that the government has to demonstrate the stamina to stay the course as long as it takes, battling the terrorists, to extinguish all hope they have that they can use violence and bombing and terror to chase the government from the field. That's absolutely crucial, or else there's very little motive for the terrorists to come to the negotiating table. It's a very tall order. It takes a long time to establish that, to eliminate that hope. But it's not impossible. We're talking not years, but decades, but it's still not impossible. Let me share with you a story that a former terrorist shared with me when I was interviewing him a few years ago. He told me that when he was 40 years old, he had already spent half his life, more than half his life, fighting the government. And he said, I looked out to the future, and I saw another 30 or 40 years of war. And I just decided I didn't want to do that. That's the moment every government is aiming for, to create that psychological reorientation in the minds of the terrorists that they cannot achieve victory through violence. So patience in the negotiation, stamina on the battlefield. The government needs one more thing. It has to identify what's been called a partner for peace. And it's really a bit of a euphemism because we're talking about not just any partner, but a very special type of individual. The partner has to have credibility within the movement, which usually means that he's been responsible for a significant amount of death and destruction. At the same time, this partner must have the political imagination to conceive of a different pathway forward, out of violence, towards a purely peaceful path. And the third thing this partner needs is that he must have the charisma, the leadership ability to be able to bring his group with him as he charts a new course. That is a pretty tall order. That is a pretty rare skill set. In Northern Ireland, the British and Irish were very fortunate in finding such an individual in Gerry Adams. In Anbar province, Iraq, in 2006, the United States was similarly fortunate in finding such an individual in Abdul Sattar Abu Risha. Despite being a member of a minor tribe in Anbar, this man had the courage to defy al-Qaeda in Iraq, the courage to publicly align himself with the U.S. military, and then the charisma to bring the other Sunni tribes with him over to our side. This became known as the Anbar Awakening. And a year to the day after which the Anbar Awakening was announced, Abdul Sattar Abu Risha was assassinated in his own home by al-Qaeda, which leads me to mention the fourth quality that a partner for peace must have. He must have the ability to stay alive long enough to make a difference. Now, up until this point, I've been talking about governments engaging terrorist movements, governments talking to terrorists. But we all know that governments don't do that. People do. And it's important for me to share with you how profoundly conflicted I felt every time I met, talked to, and sat down to negotiate with men who had so much blood on their hands. There's a moral price you have to pay if you want to do this type of work. And you have to pay that price up front, almost like a cover charge, in order to get to the negotiating table and have a chance to reach a peace agreement. For me, I found it very helpful if I could hold two competing thoughts in my mind at the same time. On the one hand, I acknowledged that the men I was dealing with had done evil and despicable things. And yet, at the same time, I hoped, I believed, that these same men held the key to unlocking a better future. I knew that I couldn't turn back the clock. I knew that I couldn't change the past. All I could do was work for a better tomorrow. But if you get it right, if you incorporate these lessons that I've mentioned, and if you're fortunate, then you may be able to stop the killing, to halt the terror, and to prevent more funerals. And if you can do that, then it truly will have been worthwhile to sit down and talk with terrorists. Thank you.